We drive to the address, our lights and sirens scattering the lunch crowd. It's a ground floor apartment and we walk in to see a toothless man doing CPR on his friend. It was heroin, he tells us, panting as he pumps. We connect the defibrillator and find the patient in a systole where the heart has lost all electrical activity. Not many will come back from that. We take over resus and the patient's mate goes to sit on the lounge. He leans over a coffee table and starts eating a meat pie with a knife and fork. Came home and found him, he says with his mouth full. The man continues eating while we try to revive his friend. He stops only once to loudly squirt ketchup onto his plate. Shit, he says. Why does it always shoot out like that? Tomato fucking sauce. He starts eating again, loud enough to hear above the siren of our approaching backup ambulance.
Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast, sponsored by Pantera Press. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Welcome back to the Good Reading Podcast. I'm Max Lewis, and today we're joined by author and filmmaker Benjamin Gilmour, whose new book, The Gap, An Australian Paramedic's Summer on the Edge, takes a confronting look at what happens before and after you dial 000. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ben.
Thanks, Max.
So before we delve into the book, aside from working as a paramedic for over 20 years, you've also written books and directed films. How did you choose to become a paramedic in the first place?
Well, I mean, I've reflected on this during the writing of this book. I really wanted to go back there and explore those early influences. And the only things I can really pinpoint are the ambulances that used to come past my parents' house. We lived quite close to the ambulance station in Lane Cove. And as the ambulances kind of headed towards Chatswood up there, they used to scream past our house. And I used to rush to the window, I think, like any kid would do. But I think that the moment when I thought I would really want to do this job, this could be good fun and interesting, was on a night out when my friends and I, probably one of the first times we went into the city. We may have been 16 years old. There were three of us. I think we might have gone to the movies or something at Hoyt's out there at Town Hall. Yeah. And we were on our way home and we're on platform 4. The North Shore line, and got down there and found at the end of the platform these two individuals who were lying unconscious on the platform. And I didn't realise at the time, but they'd overdosed on heroin. And someone had called 000, and we were kind of just bystanders and watched these two paramedics in their tight blue shirts rock up and inject these heroin patients who had overdosed on heroin with Narcan, with naloxone, which is the antidote to heroin, and it works very, very quickly. And within 30 seconds, in under a minute, each of these overdose victims who had gone from not breathing, from being blue, and on the brink of death, stand up and start breathing and then stand up. And as they stood up, one of the paramedics kind of grabbed them by the scruff of the shirt and kind of, gave them a good shake and said, if you ever do this again, and basically threatened them to sort their lives out, which I thought was a bit extreme, but it was very, very rock and roll. I thought these two paramedics coming in and reviving this pair of overdose victims was so impressive, and it was just so cool. I just thought they were the bee's knees, and I wanted to be that. I wanted to be one of them. So that was kind of stuck in my mind. And then when I left school, I used my savings to fly to India, work as a volunteer for Mother Teresa in Calcutta. And when I came back, I applied for the ambulance service, and I was accepted at the age of 19, which made me the youngest in the state paramedic at the time, or ambulance officer.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, it was good fun. I think it helped having Mother Teresa on the resume, put it that way. But that was the beginning of that journey.
And so you mentioned in the book that you're always kind of jotting down notes of all your call-outs in your little black book. Were you, even back then, planning to write about your experiences?
I think it was in my mind too. I was writing a lot of poetry back then in my late teens and early 20s, and I was reading a lot of poetry, Federico Garcia Lorca, and a lot of European poets and American poets, and
Yeah.
I was writing a lot and submitting to literary journals, Quadrant and Island magazine, and going down swinging and having that poetry published. And my first book was in fact a collection of poetry through an independent publisher in Newcastle called The Song of 100 Miles. And but I did take a few notes. I can't really find those notebooks from back then, but I really only it became a habit of mine in earnest probably halfway through my career, probably when I hit 30. Then I thought, gee, I could really do something with this material. It's just you're constantly arriving into these crisis moments in people's lives that are, a one-off moment in their lives a lot of times at the kind of, extreme climax. And you're doing that, several times a day, a shift. And so you're thrown into these stories. And you see how people live and how they treat each other, and the terrible and wonderful and bizarre situations they get themselves into. And it's incredible for a storyteller, for someone who's interested in humans and how they tick. It's a great job for that. And so I have got into the habit of jotting down events, notes, even dialogue. I mean, there's dialogue in the Gap where I have literally taken it word for word from my diaries.
And in terms of the writing style, the book really, really hammers in that breakneck pace of moving from call out to call out without a moment's rest.
Well, I didn't want the book to be dull, but in terms of the pace of it, that is the way I remember my time working out of Bondi Ambulance Station for more than a decade, and particularly the summer that this book is set in over, was that had that level of intensity. It was the pre-lockout laws. It was the mental health cases, the suicide rate was peaking and over Christmas, and it was full on. And I remember that period of time, you'd be in the city, you'd be down in Bayswater Road somewhere, back Kellett Street, back at the Cross. You'd be treating a person in an overdose on alcohol, and they'd be, the control would be calling your portable radio, asking you to clear because there was a backlog of triple O calls. Sometimes there was a dozen or more triple O calls waiting, and so you'd be really encouraged to turn around very, very quickly these jobs. Wake people up, either get them to hospital or send them on their way or put them in the cab or whatever you had to do, and then get on to the next, make yourself available for the next one. You had people who were, very seriously injured sometimes that were waiting in the queue for ambulances. So it was really a very intense time. And so I do recall that period being as intense as it's described in the book,
And so with the process of writing The Gap, what was it like revisiting this time? Because it was quite harrowing reading everything that you were going through, and I imagine it would have been pretty painful revisiting this time.
It was hard. So the first draft of the book was written about 6 months after the events of the book. And to give listeners an idea of it, The Gap is not only a collection of vignettes of the weird and wonderful, bizarre jobs that we do as paramedics, or was involved in the city at that time, but it does have a story arc through it. It has a through line of this very intense story with a beginning, middle, and an end, and that holds all this together. And so, and that was a fairly traumatic moment in my career and time in my career, and it was for many of my colleagues working in the eastern suburbs at that time. And so, yes, it was very hard. Initially, it might have been therapeutic for me 6 months after the events to write about them. But when I went back into edit, so I had it in the bottom drawer for a long time, thinking, it was too full on, it was too crazy and too sensitive material to ever release. It was one of those bottom drawer kind of books, manuscripts. And then a few of my colleagues said, no, you must put it out there. And last year I was encouraged by a few people to send it to Penguin, and they kind of rang me once they'd read it and said, we want to do this straight away. And so that was kind of a bit nerve-wracking for me to kind of come to terms with this book finally coming out. But the editing period was really tough, and that was going back into that time and kind of reliving it through the words and getting the manuscript into getting it right for publication, and that was a little bit harder. It was, but well worth it, and I think a lot of people who share their personal stories about very difficult moments in their lives, it's a sacrifice worth making, and in order to share that story and potentially help other people who are going through similar kind of experiences.
And so you mentioned having a couple of your old colleagues say that you should publish the book. Did you kind of edit and workshop the drafts of the book with some of your old partners?
Well, I did it on my own. I did call a few of them to get some confirmation of certain facts. But of course, everyone remembers things slightly differently. So, but that was really helpful. The people closest to this story, I did send them a manuscript to read before it came out, and I made a few changes based on their feedbacks. And it is difficult releasing something like this for several reasons. And not all of them I can reveal, obviously, because we're keeping the twist. There is a twist in this story. There's a very intense twist towards the end of this book that will remain a secret, but until people read it. But people needed to. There was probably a dozen people I wanted to have read the book, and that I was really hoping that they would feel comfortable with it because of the personal nature of it, And it is hard also releasing something like this as someone who's still employed by the ambulance service, essentially. So I've had to tread very carefully because the book is full of gallows humour. It doesn't take it's full of unorthodox behaviours. And it's quite out there with its humour, and it's certainly it does dance on that line of what some people would feel comfortable reading. I'm sure most people have connected very well with it and they've responded to it very well, but there was always that risk when you do share some of the conversations that we historically have in private, that it won't go down as well with everybody, and I think it's just a risk that I had to take with it. And so far the response has been amazing, and I've had almost no negative response from it, and if anything, I get emails and messages from people almost every day thanking me for sharing this story.
In particular, I think one of the most confronting parts about the book for me was the amount of call-outs for trivial reasons that you get, such as there was that scene with the woman who wanted you to go to the grocery store for her or something like that. Is the rate of call-outs like that, does it happen as often as the book makes it out?
Look, it still does. I mean, we are often called to people who, it might be cold at night and need a blanket, or as one story goes in the book, they've got a sore throat, and we end up unwrapping a lozenge for them and popping it in their mouth, or the problem is, of course, that there's only so much that you can derive over the phone. So when people call 000, they're not always great communicators, and whenever there's a risk that they're not describing their signs and symptoms that well, I think the position that the ambulance service takes, and I don't really usually comment on policy stuff, but is to err on the side of caution. So because people have fallen through the cracks in the past, so we do got a lot of calls that we really shouldn't be at, and it is a burden on the service, and being able to respond to the more serious things when you're tied up at the more minor things. At the same time, those banal, kind of bizarre non-emergencies can be so strange sometimes that they are peppered through this book because of how bizarre they are, and
they're a bit of a palate cleanser. Almost.
They certainly are. So, you don't want the, intense kind of cardiac arrest and the car accidents all the time. You get to the point in this job where you're quite happy to go to the lady who has got, a dead leg because a Labrador slept on it. You're quite happy to go to these kind of jobs that do give you a giggle afterwards, because it lightens the day, and it does get you through the day, and if you, I think for a lot of younger paramedics who are frustrated by that banality, I often tell them, just embrace it, because this is your break. This is you getting a breather between those big, intense jobs that can potentially, wear you down.
And on the other side of the spectrum, the book has a lot of alcohol-related call-outs and stuff like that. And as you said, it takes place pre-lockout laws. Did you notice any change after the lockout laws?
Absolutely, it was huge. And to give a bit of context, I've got many interests in my life apart from ambulance paramedic work, and one of them has been running club nights and DJing, and I was involved, as I mentioned, as was my partner Caspia, in one of Australia's biggest burlesque companies that was touring at the time. And so it was important to me that young people, people any age, have events and places to go at night, and can go out and go to parties and party on into the night. I'm a big supporter of that. I love that. And so I was a bit conflicted, because on the paramedic side of things, yes, we saw a huge drop. I can't really name the percentage. I think it's, but it would have been more than 80% in ambulance calls to alcohol-related issues around that King's Cross, Darlinghurst area. But the issue I have with it is that it was a blanket kind of rule. It wasn't kind of targeted enough. It wasn't kind of nuanced enough. And small bars suffered, and venues that weren't the problem and were not encouraging binge drinking were punished in the same stroke. And that's an issue that I had. But absolutely, we saw a big decline there. I would love to see those lockout laws dialed back a bit. I think that's happening now, which is encouraging to see. But a return to the way they were before, and the way the cross was before, I would hate to see that. It was really, really ugly. And you'd go through Friday, Saturday nights, and you'd be constantly mopping vomit out of the back of the ambulance, and you're dealing with people lying in the gutter, covered in their own spew. It's terrible. It wasn't pretty.
And so the main theme, I guess, of The Gap is the toll that working as a paramedic takes on your mental health, and the lack of support and seeking help for that. In the decade plus since the events of the book, has there been much change in the culture surrounding the mental health of emergency workers, or the support that is provided to them?
There has been, and I'm very grateful, and a lot of work's been done in the last 5 years in particular on that. We have wellness workshops now. We have chaplains, counsellors, peer support officers, and significant event registers where if there's a particularly nasty case, that it's documented and there's follow-up. So there's a lot more support for us. At the same time, it's difficult, because although the support's available, a lot of paramedics, certainly I have this issue. I don't reach out when I probably should, and I think that's something in our culture in general in Australia, particularly among men. We're not good at reaching out when we're really struggling, and that's not something that can be enforced. It's not, so you can have this whole raft of services available and still be suffering in silence. There's still work to be done about kind of reducing that stigma. So although we're happy to help others who have got mental health issues, we're very reluctant still. And that's been backed up now with a study by Beyond Blue, who did a study on how emergency workers are affected, and found that we're more than willing to accept that mental illness is a huge issue, and we majority of our patients now, probably certainly in the inner city, you're looking at more than 50% of cases. It's the second most common call after falls in the elderly. So we're happy, willing to accept that these are legitimate health issues, but just not in ourselves a lot of the time. And I think there's still work needs to be done there.
And just to plug your other book and your documentary, Paramedico, that looks at ambulance workers across the world in Pakistan, Mexico, Venice, and Hawaii. I was wondering how the lives of paramedics in those countries compared to your own experience in Australia.
Well, it's a great question because I was very blessed to have the opportunity to travel to more than 10 countries and ride along or work or volunteer with paramedics and other ambulance workers in these countries and see, what it's like for our colleagues in these places. And it made me so, grateful for the work conditions that I have back home here. In Pakistan, for example, ambulance workers will be on shift for a month straight. They often don't get time to eat or drink anything on shift. They are really flogged, and for $15 a week. So really low wage.
Wow. Yeah.
Or Johannesburg, where you're going to shootings and stabbings and violent crime. Back when I worked there, around the clock. And just there seems to be no relief from that. And then the risks, the dangers. I was working there with another paramedic, and we both had to wear flak jackets, bulletproof vests, just to go to these emergencies for risks of being shot ourselves. So we don't have to deal with that. I mean, even in the States, having done work there, you never know when you go to a door whether someone behind that door will have, a weapon, a loaded gun, which is something I don't have to really think. I don't think twice about here. We have situational awareness here, but I don't really imagine that someone's going to have a gun. So I'm very grateful for our work conditions here, and that book did very well, I think, because a lot of ambulance workers around the world read it, particularly in Western nations, and it kind of gave them a bit of perspective. And I think there's a lot of reformed whingers out there who'd read that book and were like, "Oh, actually, we don't have it so bad."
And so your most recent film, Joga, premiered at the Sydney Film Festival last year and is currently screening in the United States. Could you tell us a little bit more about the film?
Again, Joga is, it relates to this theme of that I've addressed in The Gap. It relates to, mental health in men, and it's the story of a soldier, a veteran, who is racked by guilt. He has a kind of a moral injury from having been involved in a night raid in Afghanistan that went wrong. And instead of, like so many veterans, sadly, instead of taking his life, as so many veterans have done because of their PTSD and experiences on the battlefield, he does a kind of unprecedented thing, a very radical thing, and buys a ticket back to Afghanistan to try and find the family of a civilian that he remembers killing, an unarmed civilian, to apologise to the family. It was a film, Joga, that premiered at the Sydney Film Festival and screened at Toronto and Palm Springs Film Festivals, and it became the Australian entry to the Academy Awards Best Foreign Language Film this year. And now it's out on streaming and iTunes and various platforms in the US, and it's on Stan in Australia for those who are interested. But it kind of deals with these similar issues that are very close to my heart, because I've lost friends, and we have a huge issue in this country with depression and suicide amongst men, so it's all kind of related.
Yeah, it's all intertwined.
Intertwined, indeed.
Well, Benjamin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Max, for having me. I appreciate it.
The Gap is published by Penguin Random House and can be found at our website at goodreadingmagazine.com.au or any good bookshop.